If you'd like to support the show and listen ad-free on any podcast player, you can follow the link in our episode descriptions to become an Acast Plus member for as little as $1 per month. It'd be hugely appreciated.
Looking to get into the Halloween spirit? Acast recommends the most chilling podcasts. Tune in and beware.
It's been nearly 5 years since Dr. Rouge disappeared.
One family!
She'd promised to make the world rich with her revolutionary cryptocurrency, OneCoin.
You're amazing, guys.
But OneCoin was a lie. Join me, Jamie Bartlett, as we scour the globe looking for Rouge's missing millions.
I think you need to start looking at the very, very, very top of that country.
The missing crypto queen is back.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
Welcome back to part 2 of the morality of everyday things. The question today, are landlords evil? In part 1, we looked at the housing crisis in the UK/the West in general, and we described the economics behind the problem of the lack of affordable housing. We then got into a debate about whether housing should be treated as an asset, justifying earning rents and stuff like that, because the problems that arise when speculators enter the housing market are, they're problems.
Which is particularly a market of a necessary good.
Exactly.
Funny anecdote. Well, actually, first the intro stuff. Morality. You said part 2 of the morality of everyday things. No, this is a continuation. It's part 2 of the episode on evil landlords.
You're right, yeah. Part 2 of that episode.
God, Jake, why do I keep you around? So, Morality of Everyday Things is a podcast about everyday morality. You know, simple questions like this, the kind of things you might think about in your day-to-day life. I'm Ant.
I'm Jake.
Longtime friends, business partners, and podcast partners.
Oh, you said we're friends.
Aww.
That's what you keep me about.
That's why I keep you around.
Because I add value. We'll come back to that.
It's because you generate yield, Jake. And so I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who leaves reviews. Spotify, Apple, all super helpful. You can become an Acast Plus member to avoid the ad roll. The ads that are at the beginning, maybe in the middle, undecided. Also, we have a TikTok, so check that out. There'll be funny little clips of us. I mean, you listen to the episodes, pretty same. It's also on YouTube. One other thing, talking about housing, an anecdote I totally forgot. Talking about Western places where housing market is crazy. We went and visited a friend in Vancouver.
Oh my God, yeah.
Okay, first of all, did not realize, I think they call it like Hongcouver, because it's like as bad as Hong Kong.
It's very high rise. Very high rise.
Lots of high rises, and the market is crazy, and we didn't know this. And also actually largely similar to London, it's because of a lot of extremely wealthy people from Asia coming and buying up. A kind of another reason it's Hongcouver. Right. Does that make it a racist term? I don't know. Anyway, hey, I'm making it onto the socials. What up?
Moving swiftly on.
We went and stayed with a friend who's a PhD, and he says, don't worry, you can stay at mine, okay?
I've got a room for you.
Yeah, he's I've got a room. Okay, we get to his place. He is literally living in an airing cupboard with a single bed.
Yeah, it had the bloody grills on the door.
The grates at the bottom for air to come through. And he says, we're like, what the hell, man? And he says, like, oh, no, don't worry. We're going to rotate that and being in the living room. And we're like, what the? If you'd have told us we'd got an Airbnb, now it's crazy expensive because it's like next day.
Yeah, it was so grim.
And like, he had one of his roommates. It was horrible.
The lounge had like a leather sofa and a window with no curtain. So when the sun shone in the morning, you just sort of woke up stuck to the sofa.
Exactly.
So I think I had that on the first night, and I was like, oh God, please give me the airing cupboard. What I wouldn't give for the airing cupboard.
And that is exactly how most people in the housing market feel at the moment. Back to today's episode. Okay. To continue from last time, we're going to talk about whether it's morally justifiable to encourage housing as an asset class. We're going to look at potential policy solutions as well. And, we'll generally talk about the morality of it around, this is one of those episodes where it's like actually on a scale of like practical to conceptual. This is more on the practical end, but there's some conceptual things. Like we said, we talked a lot about like, should you get returns for owning assets in general?
It's true.
In fact, actually something we didn't mention last time, something worth talking, maybe it comes up later, but Piketty.
Yes, Piketty does come up later.
Then we'll save it for later. Carry on.
Today's question to begin, we're still talking about are landlords evil, but we're looking at the sub-question of whether it's justifiable to view housing as an asset class, particularly when housing is a necessity and, I said that so weirdly, when housing is a necessity and homelessness in particular is a big problem in our society.
Housing is a kind of unique asset class because it's extremely rivalrous, right? And it's just because the supply is so constrained. But basically, I'm not depriving anyone else by owning it, right? Like, my owning Amazon stock doesn't stop you owning Amazon stock.
Technically, right? I suppose there's a limited number, right?
Well, technically, yeah. But I mean, in practice, supply isn't a constraint.
Yeah. Whereas in housing, I suppose what you're saying is if you live in a house, I can't live there too. There's only room for one in the airing cupboard.
Although that said, actually, stock prices move. That's why. Anyway, so people may make lots of money trading stocks, buying stock. You are arguably not taking that opportunity away from other people, right? Certainly as an individual.
In liquid markets, right?
In liquid markets, and when you're an individual buyer, that's relatively true. Even if you would say you're not depriving someone more. This is the more important thing. Even if I was taking the opportunity away from you, I'm not depriving you of something that is a fundamental need in the way that housing is.
It's that word necessity, which we talked about quite a bit in the first episode, and that's the key thing. That's what makes housing different. People need housing. You don't need stocks.
The last couple episodes have really been on kind of like a Marxist bend. What do you need? Do you need things? Luxuries are immoral. Houses are needed.
Cool. Well, let's now introduce the philosopher John Rawls and his conception of distributive justice.
So what Rawls is concerned with is how things are distributed throughout society and whether we can say that those things are distributed in a just way or not.
So to do this, here's this great thought experiment. It's called the veil of ignorance. And he says, step back behind the veil and imagine that we're designing society and you have no idea who you are going to be. We've talked about this before, I believe, in the episode on billionaires, and you had a really nice analogy, which was imagine everyone has lawyers and they're going to a conference and they're going to design who should get what in this new society.
They're going to argue your case.
They're going to argue your case, and then because they flew Ryanair, they lose all their luggage, and no one has any, they've lost the case files. No one knows any details about you, who they're representing.
They're all arguing with each other, and all they know is that they're just people in a society. They don't know anything about your specifics.
They don't know you're male or female. They don't know if you come from a wealthy family or
they don't know if you have a buy-to-let property portfolio or that you won't be able to afford rent.
Exactly.
Right? And so these lawyers are going to have to come together and argue, how should we structure things then?
What follows from that is a really nice result, according to Rawls, which is that not knowing where you're going to come out, it's arguable that you probably wouldn't want the kind of society that we live in now. What you'd want is two principles. I can remember one, which is basically you want the least well-off person in society to be as well-off as possible. You want to maximize that. So if you end up representing someone who is the most disadvantaged as they enter the society, you want to look after that case. You want to maximize the minimum.
Yeah. The other things with that, you'd want to maximize liberties insofar as it doesn't get in the way of other people, and you'd also want to make sure that any special powers, privileges, etc., are accessible, are attached to positions that are accessible to everyone. Maybe not necessarily practically. I don't know that he argues for equality of.
He definitely doesn't argue for perfect equality, does he?
No, exactly. It's more about opportunity. It is technically possible for anyone to. No one should be enshrined in the law to be special. Monarchy.
So let's apply this to the housing example. Imagine from behind the veil of ignorance, you could be a professional landlord with 10 properties that you rent out, or you could be homeless. Not knowing where you're going to come out, it's arguable that from behind the veil of ignorance, you wouldn't want to pick the society that we live in now. And given that some people reject it, this for Rawls would mean that this formulation of society would not be just.
Yep. By the way, to articulate the thing you're saying about maximizing the minimum, I think the exact phrasing is that to the extent that society is unequal, it should be to the benefit of the least well-off. Right? So the argument is it's all well and good to have a capitalist society because that means that the overall society can do better than a communist society or a planned socialist. So it's not saying we should live in a Big Brother-esque, everyone has assigned their house. He's not saying that there shouldn't be a market because clearly some amount of market is useful. The point he's making is that there should be regulation where if there are empty homes and homeless people, we should be organizing society to be to the benefit of those people who are worst off, those homeless people.
Absolutely. I think it's really appealing. I absolutely love this theory. I think it applies really well to this. It's exactly like what you're saying. It's like thresholds. It's basically making sure that the minimum threshold has a safety net. If you are homeless, that you can have access to a home. It's looking after that person.
Yeah. Basically, are there policies we can institute that will make the people who are worst off better off?
Yeah.
Yes. So by Rawls' estimation, we are not the most just society that we could be. One other perspective that's interesting in this sort of, or kind of a perspective or framework of thought for approaching this, that I know you're a big fan of because you read the book, is from Michael Sandel, and it's Sandel or Sandel?
I always say Sandel. It's spelled like sandal.
Michael Flip Flop. And basically, he wrote that book.
What Money Can't Buy.
What Money Can't Buy. And it's basically, should there be a market for everything? Should some things not have markets? To give some examples, organs. Are we in some way defiling something about the sanctity of the human body by creating a market for organs?
Should you have a market for votes? Should you be allowed to sell your vote to other people?
Why is that not acceptable? Should there be a market for sex? right? Are you in some way degrading sex by having a market for it?
He's really interesting. And to kind of sum up his views, he makes two key arguments. One is that by making something marketable, by selling it, you can fundamentally alter the nature of the good you're selling. That's what you were just saying about the sanctity of the good.
Yep.
You change it by making it up for sale. A vote should be, for example, a democratic right, key to a functioning democracy. But if you make it something you can sell, then you fundamentally undermine that principle. The other point he makes is about bargaining power, which is that if you make a market for everything, then people who have more bargaining power have... it just makes society unequal. And that's problematic, because it goes back to what we said last episode about consent, that consent isn't as simple as people saying, yes or no, I agree to this, because some people are fundamentally disadvantaged. They lack that bargaining power. And again,
They lack an alternative.
that's what makes markets unfair. Sandel's saying, rather than there being a market economy, which is a tool, we're instead a market society, which is much more pervasive. He says basically the way we treat things with this capitalist kind of agenda is that we treat everything as if it's marketable, but that shouldn't necessarily be the case. And housing is a question mark. We very much treat housing as being in a market, but that is a function of the way we've designed the incentives.
I suppose it's a little different because it's one of those things where I don't think that there's a sanctity of a housing market, or I don't think you're fundamentally altering it. It's more that it's a need, right? So I guess on the scale of things, we'll give a couple of examples and then we'll say which ones does it seem to relate to. An example would be financial incentives for teachers whose students get better results, or the right to immigrate somewhere, which you can obtain if you invest a certain amount in some. So, for example, you can buy residency in Europe by buying properties in Portugal or Greece or places like that for 200K. The US, you can set up a business and employ people, and you can get a green card. Where do you think housing sits on this scale?
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, his point, like we've said, is when money's able to buy almost anything, then financial inequality matters even more. And for example, landlords statistically are less likely to rent to a person on universal credit or benefits. But the point is that for these people, they've often already been shut out from home ownership.
There's an irony with that as well, the difficulty of renting when you're on universal credit or on benefits, which is that you actually need an address to do that. So, if you're homeless staying at a hostel, something like that, then actually you can't even get the housing element of universal credit payment. But Sandel makes the argument that we ought to contend with these inequalities by better determining where markets belong and where they don't.
Yeah, exactly. And indeed, without intervention, it does seem that, at least according to the economist Thomas Piketty, who we'll go on to explain, if we do nothing, then actually these inequalities are only going to get worse.
Yep. So I guess housing, when I think about it, probably sits somewhere in between for someone like Sandel, right? Because his argument is largely around where markets shouldn't exist at all.
Yeah.
Right. And in this case, I think it's more that this should be a highly regulated market. Maybe a good analogy, and it'd be interesting to get his perspective on it, would be food, right? So in some circumstances, let's say in a refugee camp, food should effectively not have a market, right? Because there should be no incentive for someone to steal other people's food to sell or not feed their family, right? And then, in a more complex market economy where there, perhaps there's enough food, but maybe when you're a constraint, say for example, post-Ukraine, there's issues with grain. Should people be allowed to make profits, speculate on grain when people are going to need to eat that?
Certainly seems distasteful, doesn't it? But
seems distasteful. That's when maybe you maintain a market, but you regulate it, right? So I don't know, stop leveraged buys and stuff like that.
Yeah, we'll come back to, there are policy tools in place to do this. You could look at government subsidies and you could look at taxation as simple tools to manipulate. That seems too strong a word, but you know what I mean, to affect the market.
Here's a nice example I heard the other day. Should you be able to sell your GP appointment? Right? So the problem with this, and this is kind of similar to the housing market, right? On the one hand, it makes sense and it's efficient, right? On the other hand, there's a regulatory problem, right? And this is actually so similar to housing. The problem is you've created an incentive for the demand side to grow. Suddenly, go and get a GP appointment. Even if you don't want to go, you can sell it. Right?
Exactly.
So go and buy a house. Even if you don't want to live in it, you can rent it. Right? That's the analogy. So what you should be doing is, if you're going to have this market, you should regulate to stop this excess demand. That's one. There's also, specific to the GP appointment thing, there's some specifics around okay, this is the part we're going to get to Piketty. The more that there is inequality, the more that this is going to disproportionately hurt the poor over time. Because basically, poor people won't go and get checks because it's always going to make more sense to sell their thing unless it's an absolute emergency.
I think what's really nice about that analogy as well, just thinking about it, is that the excess demand that's created by the system doesn't do anything to supply. It's a secondary market. Yeah. So it doesn't create any incentives for supply in that case to, GPs aren't necessarily going to be able to provide more supply, or certainly not more affordable supply.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's actually a great analogy in that way that technically, okay, if GPs are always booked, there's some pressure to get more GPs, and maybe GPs can, maybe we can say, look, GPs are doing so much good, we can, and we're making money in this market. market, we could hire more.
And private healthcare kind of does exist like that, right? It sort of fills that gap.
Exactly. But there are limits to how many we can hire. It takes time to train them, same way it takes time to build houses.
Yep.
And also, if we're going to have such a leveraged market, like the demand is going to keep kind of snowballing, right? Because the more that there is demand, the more that there's more people coming into this network of needing GP appointments, the higher you're going to be able to charge per slot. So supply is relatively constrained. It's actually a really good analogy.
Nice. Well, let's link that to Thomas Piketty. Quick summary of Piketty's views, and this is a little bit of economic history. So Piketty, he's an economist, I think an econometrician, really. He analysed reams of data going back in history, and one of the things he observed was that owning capital being, I guess, any asset that can be owned and generates an income, that didn't really help in the 20th century, predominantly because of the loss of wealth that was caused by the two world wars, and therefore the market value of capital didn't grow as fast as the rest of the economy at large. However, we've returned to a pattern from Victorian times, which is that capital is now growing more than the rest of the economy at large. This means that if you own capital, you'll get richer proportionally than the rest of the economy. And specifically, he has this equation which basically says the returns to capital outstrip the returns to labor.
It's amazing how like his entire book can be summarized in 3 symbols.
Yeah, it's
like
brilliant, isn't it?
Small c greater than little l, which is basically saying the returns to capital are greater than the returns to labor.
Which means that if you sell your time, you get less money for it than if you sell, if you rent out or sell your assets.
Yeah. And this is the thing where, like, actually, when we start to think about that, this kind of comes back to the, like, should you get returns for owning assets question, right? Like, there is something that feels fundamentally wrong about the idea that, like, even if you're doing it in a value constructive way, right? If you are just owning things, even if you're then doing things with the things, like if you're leveraged up by the sheer fact that you own lots of stuff, should you ever be generating more returns than someone who's actually working, right? That feels, because the problem with that is it's the ultimate, like, it means that the inevitable distribution, if you can see me on camera, is going to be like a U, right?
Yeah.
Even if you start with a peak around the average, all that's going to happen is as people get more wealth, the wealth is going to generate more wealth faster than your working can.
It's that phrasing like wealth gets sticky upwards, and it describes that problem of, like, as you say, you accrue a certain amount of wealth and suddenly you're on a road to becoming wealthier. And for people who are never able to accumulate something like that to begin with, to be fair, this kind of describes that, like, Thatcher era obsession with rent, like being able to get on the housing ladder, being able to own assets, because people recognize that there is value and return in that, and that's why people care so much about it. Not that it's perfect, but, like, it's really problematic. And I agree with you, there does seem to be a kind of moral quality to this, which is like, the idea that renting something is more accretive than selling your time. It seems weird for the distribution of value or creation of value in society.
It seems like in a weird capitalist society, and I mean, to be fair, it's called capitalist. This should be fairly obvious, but it seems weird. It seems weird in a capitalist society where so much of, say, for example, the American narrative or the UK narrative is like, if you work hard, you can do better. To then empirically be told, actually, working hard isn't as important as just owning stuff.
That's it. It
literally it
undermines the American dream.
Yeah, and people don't understand the power of compounding, I think. Like, if the return to owning stuff is 1% higher, that means that after 72 years, they're going to end up with double on top.
It's that sort of Trump-esque, you start off with a small $1 million loan.
Yeah. Actually, it reminds me of that quote people say, like, people, sometimes super rich people say, like, the hardest is the first million. And I think some people kind of turn that into, like, this kind of, like, and that's because I learned so much along the way and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, it's because you have built your safety net and now your million is making money while you're doing stuff.
What's that, like, classic meme about how you make money quickly in terms of, like, 5
I
steps?
love that. It's like 5 steps. Or like, it's always like how I became a multi-millionaire. Step 1, wake up at 5 a.m. every day and do meditation. Step 2, eat my breakfast before 6 a.m. Step 3, work out for an hour and a half. Step 4, my dad is a billionaire. Step 5, do yoga.
That's a good step. Sail on my yacht.
Yeah, that was. I think it was that kid who went in Bezos's.
The rocket.
Yeah, the rocket.
Yeah, that was the example, wasn't it?
Anyway, this is the point of Piketty's issue. He's saying, like, when the returns to capital are greater than the returns to labor, and this relates to the housing thing.
It does.
When the people who can access this asset class are going to have their wealth grow at a rate that is so much faster than people who are actually working, which is just the fundamental issue.
That's it. And the unavailability of affordable houses means that it's getting progressively harder for people to buy houses in the first place. That exacerbates the same difference that you're just describing. That drives rents up, keeping them from buying the very thing that would help to actually close the gap instead of widening it.
Yep. I mean, so this is kind of one of those ones where it just brings me back to, like, the idea of people talk about free markets, right?
And we talked about this last episode when we looked at, like, Nozik's example of, like, hey, it's a fair trade.
Yep. When I talk at a market level, right, I think, and when I use the term free market, I think it's so interesting that, like, when you study economics, right, and you study, like, for example, a competitive market, which is what, when people talk about free markets from an economic perspective, that everyone's imagining, like, competitive market. In a competitive market, there is no profit, right? All profit in kind of Bezos style is competed away. Your margin is my opportunity, right? And that's actually good for consumers, right? Because it means that, profit is, in a way, value that is being captured by a company rather than being passed out to society, right? Instead, what's happening when we talk about free markets is that people are going to turn this into markets that are free of regulation, right? And what we should be doing is we should be regulating every market that doesn't function like a competitive market so that it is as competitive as possible. So it shouldn't be profitable to just buy and hold a house, right? There's something broken there. It's the leverage that's making it make sense. And also it means that, like, a 2% yield on rent, which is actually not that uncommon in London, it is actually profitable. Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, that's less than markets. We shouldn't have that being more interesting than people going and doing, primary investments. Sorry, a little ramble there.
Just to challenge you on one part of that, though, you make it sound like sort of making the market competitive is the ultimate aim. But I suppose it does go slightly beyond that, right? In terms of, yes, a competitive market means it's efficient, which is functioning, which is where we want to get to. But it's also about imposing views on, like, fundamentally what we're looking at here is, there's rights and needs and we should treat housing that way. And I think to some extent we do have a competitive housing market. It's just that the incentives are misaligned with the social outcome that we'd care.
Sorry, I got into my economics hat and I was just thinking about term free market, and I made a big assumption there, a big assumptive statement that we should aspire for all markets to be competitive. But no, minimum wage is a really good example of, like, the competitive outcome isn't the same as the right outcome because we're not, there's an externality we're not factoring in, which is dignity and access to fundamental needs and the fact that people don't have reasonable alternatives, right? So you're right. Like, we need to set a minimum, which actually minimum wage is a perfect economic example. Plenty of studies on minimum wage in the UK over the, I think it was like 80s, 90s, noughties. They found that, like, everyone was like, minimum wage is not going to work. It's going to ruin the labor market. Like, all it did was actually just eat a percentage of corporate profits. That was it. Which, like, that's fine. Like, considering that we care about human dignity, to trade, a small amount of corporate profit for more people to live in dignified situations totally made sense. So you're right. Sorry, actually, the presumptive statement that everything should be a competitive market, it should still function as a competitive market, but we should not leverage so much, and there should be floors similar to minimum wages. So that's actually a way better analogy.
Nice. I like that. So that's a good place to wrap up our discussion of viewing housing as an asset class. We've talked a lot about that. We've given the capitalist perspective. We've given contradictions to that. We talked about Piketty, all these things.
Couple moral bits and pieces. It's a really good way to segue into the final question of this episode. What should we do about the housing market and particularly the housing crisis? I guess one thing that we touched on is, this is a really big policy suggestion. Should we consider some form of universal basic housing or other alternative in order to save the housing crisis? I guess a practical way of phrasing that, this isn't very practical, but build a time machine, go back to the 80s, don't sell off all the social housing, which means that more people have a reasonable alternative to privately owning a home, like socially affordable housing. It has trade-offs, but it's affordable. According to those such as Rawls, some kind of housing provision that evens the housing market playing ground would be a society that you'd want to live in, right? Again, imagine the lawyer who's going and arguing, the lawyer doesn't know that you're homeless, right? You'd want him to be protecting the homeless people. You don't know if you're homeless behind the veil of ignorance. You'd agree to that original position, presumably, for a risk that you're one of the 300,000 households.
Let's have a look at some societies that offer, if not literally a kind of universal basic housing provision, more support in terms of providing houses to its citizens. Because, we've focused quite a lot on the UK and the US, which have very similar sort of policies and outcomes in respect of the way they treat housing.
Relatively free housing markets, extremely leveraged, lots of foreign ownership and speculation.
Absolutely. But that's not the case worldwide. For example, in Singapore, 3/4 of housing is built by the Housing and Development Board. And home ownership is supported by funding from the Central Provident Fund, which is a compulsory savings and pension plan for permanent residents and workers. Because of this, home ownership in Singapore is at about 90%.
Wow.
Yeah. Big wow.
What crucially supports this is that leaseholds of housing provided by the Housing and Development Board are for 99 years. Private renters in the US have an average of 4 years, according to the English Housing Survey. Wow.
What's the point of a 99-year lease? Well, this is so that land won't be permanently allocated, and therefore the government can get that land back to then redevelop it, allegedly to be fair to future generations. So there's this governmental incentive in place to kind of make sure the land is being used in the best way.
Yeah, however, there are concerns about properties depreciating in value, and it fails to give a sufficient enough safeguard to their leaseholders. At least in the UK, though, I know that you can extend your lease. There's legally you're entitled to do that.
Yeah. Nonetheless, for most residents, that it covers a whole lifetime, just not more than Not more than literally a lifetime.
Yeah, it's kind of like introducing the way that a car depreciates or runs out of life. Right? It's not only Singapore that has stronger housing provision than the UK. In countries like Germany, where over the last 250 years the housing market paid for by housing benefit has grown considerably. Most significantly, their social housing assistance is specifically aimed at those who would not otherwise be able to find appropriate accommodation on the housing market to be able to live in.
Yeah, the provision in Germany is predominantly aimed at rental as opposed to buying, since only 52% of Germans actually own a property. In Germany, there's really no benefit to owning as opposed to renting, which is very different to, I guess, the cultural attitude in the UK. Part of that is driven by the fact that Germans as a whole spend a far lower percentage of their salary on rent compared to the UK. And that's really interesting, right?
It's funny how rental inflation is one of the things that drives the buying market. It's like we said, people are trying to grab the ladder before it is pulled up.
Yeah, exactly. It's that whole kind of UK narrative that paying rent is just effectively throwing money down the drain compared to paying off a mortgage, which feels like an investment. And it's literally, I mean, they joke about that in like Gavin and Stacey and stuff. It's just like, yeah, renting is just pissing money away. But
you know,
it's a pervasive attitude in this country.
I find it's so interesting when people say this for 2 or 3 reasons, right? It's a total misunderstanding of what a mortgage is, right? People are like, oh, why would you pay to rent a place when you could get a mortgage and own it and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, yeah, but you do realize that when you're paying off your mortgage, you're mostly paying rent on the money you've borrowed, right? Granted, you own the house, and like in a market where they're constantly going up, that's great. But like, there's a number of reasons why it's not so great, and you are also like leveraging yourself on the downside by having a mortgage, right? Like if you have a 5% deposit mortgage and the house goes down in 5%, then you've lost the entirety of your mortgage.
Negative equity, right?
Yeah, you can actually owe more money than the house is worth, and I think people forget that because we're so in this loop where it's like housing must go up
until it doesn't,
until 08, and then people are totally bankrupt.
It's interesting though, because you're right. It's a big sort of cultural point, and I think part of that, and the reason it's a problem is because rents are really high. In theory, in like the German market, for example, if rents are affordable, or certainly affordable as a percentage of your overall salary, renting provides you with more flexibility. You aren't responsible for the same level of maintenance and upkeep as you are if you own. You have the freedom to move and live where you want, which actually, as a young person in general, seems kind of appealing.
Yep. Also, I think the idea of like people like, oh, paying off your mortgage, owning more of your house, misunderstanding. You own the entirety of your house, and separately, you have a debt with an interest rate. The interest rate on mortgages tends to be like 2, 3, 4%. Like the long-term returns to the stock market is 7 or 8%. You're often better off investing in the stock market than paying down your mortgage.
Interesting.
Just a little thought thing there. Anyway, other European countries that share higher rates of renters compared to owners, such as Switzerland, have their own policies to try and make this the case. And this is, maybe is a more desirable outcome for someone like the UK. If we're all going to be renters, like let's make the market better for them. Switzerland does seem to lack a social housing program similar to Germany's. I mean, they have it, but not quite as strong as Germany's. Instead, since 1984, there's been a limit on how many non-Swiss residents are able to purchase a property, making it almost impossible for second properties to be bought by overseas residents.
The Swiss are also encouraged to rent because tenants are protected by a significant amount of regulations, and tax on rental income is high.
So rather than buy and rent out and stuff. Whilst this isn't a form of universal basic housing, like we said, it does explain why renting is so much more popular in Switzerland. You might not need a form of universal basic housing if you can just implement policies that are designed to combat housing crisis at the key points that's hitting it. So we're talking the buy-to-let portfolio manager, super leveraged multi-portfolio property managers. We're talking foreign buyers who perhaps are not even living there, or actually even if they are, like, even if there are people who are legitimately coming and want to live there, arguably as a national policy, it's annoying to say because I'm an international person and I value like openness and free migration, etc. But still, like, I could see the argument that as a government, your policy should prioritize making sure your citizens have access to affordable housing and make it harder for foreigners to buy homes unless they're legitimately moving over.
Totally. And you could look at subsidizing the development of affordable housing and all sorts of other incentives like that. All of this raises an interesting question of whether we actually, could you address this at like a cultural source and design things that affect the way we value home ownership as highly as we do in the UK? In other words, should we value home ownership as highly as we do in the UK?
Well, I mean, home ownership in the UK has been described as a UK tradition. I mean, a very famous UK turn of phrase, a man's home is his castle. Like, it's very important, that idea of like, this is my space. But the problem with that is that, especially given the rates for millennials owning a home is dropped dramatically compared to previous generations. That means that owning a home is something that's getting further and further out of reach. I mean, like, there's lots of old cultural norms that are kind of not so wise that we should let go of.
Exactly. The average deposit is now roughly 57 grand, which then is no wonder that there are a few first-time buyers who are fortunate enough to be able to afford to either save that themselves or have a helping hand from their parents, right?
Yeah, which is, again, we'll do an episode on inheritance tax next, but this kind of intergenerational wealth, even it makes that kind of returns to capital is greater than returns to labor. it makes that even worse because you have a longer period to compound over when you're passing it down over generations without some sort of redistributive impact happening there. So it seems that this tradition isn't really working as it is intended.
I think that's certainly why there's so much tension, right? Because the culture and the idea definitely exist, but it's becoming further and further out of reach, particularly for young people.
Yep.
And that's why it's such a media story.
Yep. And I think the government, provides a lot of help to help promote ownership and get people on the ladder. But it's fundamentally missing the point. It's over-financializing solutions. It's giving people 5% deposits instead of 10, 20, 30% deposits that are actually mean that the mortgage rate will be affordable. It's why now it's often not a saving to mortgage rather than rent, right? All of this is adding up to stacking cards higher and higher on top of each other. It's like, oh, well, if mortgages aren't affordable, here's a lower rate mortgage. Or, there's lots of companies where it's like, here's a loan to boost your deposit for your mortgage. And it's like, this isn't fixing the fundamental problem.
It's just compounding your debt.
Yeah, you're actually making it worse. You're leveraging it more.
Here's an interesting side discussion. You might argue if there was some form of universal basic income, then we wouldn't need some kind of universal basic housing. And this focus on home ownership could then persist. As UBI could be the kind of catch-all silver bullet that addresses everything. And I'm a big fan of UBI. We haven't yet done an episode on that, so that's another one we'll look at in the future. But in theory, if all people have enough money to at least cover rent, if not then be able to get a house, that's a good place to start. However, when the idea of universal basic income was first introduced by William Beveridge in the 1940s, he encountered the, quote, problem of rent, unquote. This is because if you pay a flat rate allowance for housing, there'll be some people for whom this is not enough and others for whom it is too much. And because of this, most proposals for UBI tend to ignore housing costs. So housing creates an interesting kind of loop, I suppose.
This is the thing that we were discussing earlier, right? Where it's like, you've stated that you're very, very interested in UBI. I've stated I like the principle, the moral principle. I don't know about the economic impact. This is one of the main economic criticisms where it's like, okay, if you just give everyone money so they can afford houses, all that's going to happen is everyone's going to try and, rent or buy houses, and it's just the cost will inflate, and then the money you've given them is not worth as much, and you've kind of counteracted this. I don't think it would happen to that same extent, but it's a big enough problem that, like you said, usually proposals ignore housing costs. And it's why something like access to housing via something like social housing may be a better way of doing it, and general policies to constrict unnecessary leaking of supply to foreign investors and buy-to-let managers and stuff.
Yeah. I'm not sure which shelter it was that said this, but there was a housing charity shelter that said you can't solve for the affordability of housing without making genuinely affordable homes. And that kind of comes back to that supply problem that we discussed all along.
That's it. And that was the thing I was saying about government help to buy schemes and stuff like that. It's you're not fixing the problem. The only way that you can be fixing it is not by making it quote unquote more affordable for people who don't have money. It's by limiting the people who are just speculating, because then you're improving supply. It's focusing on supply, not demand, that you need to, cutting out unnecessary demand and improving supply.
So to wrap up this section, what do we think? What solutions appeal to you?
I think I've said it along the way, but try limit as much as possible two types of buyers, and these are really inefficient buyers. Foreign buyers, particularly ones who aren't even going to live there. There should be a huge tax for owning a property that's not used, a certain amount per year. So even the second home, okay, I can just about put up if you're going to be at least 4 or 5 months a year there, if you're really back and forth between the two. But should anyone own a home that they're there for 2 weeks a year? You should at least have to do a holiday rental or something, make use of it, right? And then the other one is obviously foreign buyers laundering money. I mean, they shouldn't be allowed to anyway, because some of them are laundering money. But particularly because it's just taking housing out of stock, and also an incentive to make stupid luxury penthouses and stuff like that.
And it's just speculation, isn't it?
That's one. Another one, I think it should be less appealing to be a buy-to-let landlord. And I think that they're doing this over time. They are making it less and less appealing. But they should basically also not make it accessible to get access to these super leveraged mortgages for the purpose of speculation, right? If you're not an incidental... Actually, we said at the very beginning of the first episode, the difference between an incidental owner and a professional owner. The clearest heuristic is, do you have a buy-to-let mortgage? Right? Do you own the place, or do you have a buy-to-let mortgage? Yeah,
exactly. Because if you do, then you can totally design tax policies that are unique to that scenario, right?
Yeah. I think. And then also, I don't know enough practically about this, but we need to shake up the land planning. To we know we need more houses. It should be a priority for government to make more houses. So we need to shake up our land, our what's the term for that? City planning. Whatever the term is, the rules around what land you can and can't use, and try and provide more quickly, and provide some sort of tax incentives or tax breaks to people to make affordable homes rather than luxury ones. There's so many policy options, but reduce unnecessary speculative demand, increase supply of reasonable non-luxury homes.
Yeah, I think you can split solutions into two camps, can't you? You can address supply, which is what you're just discussing, which is make affordable housing more appealing to build, incentivize that, subsidize it, actually have specific things that mean that we create more and address the planning side of it. Another stronger example would be the provision of universal basic housing. It still relies on the actual creation of those places to begin with in the first place.
I guess when there's not enough places, it's just how do you I just don't see a practical route to that. I mean, like a policy goal like the government needs to make more social housing over the next decade feels like a doable policy. We should make universal basic housing. I'm like, how does that function?
Yeah, that's a more sort of longer term vision, isn't it? So you've got that
you can't
side.
just suddenly snap your fingers and have all the houses for everyone.
Yeah. But I think certainly, stuff to increase the provision of social housing that addresses the supply part of the problem. And then on the demand side, it's kind of what you said. It's basically disincentivizing the wrong kind of demand from entering the market, disincentivizing those foreign
money launderers.
Thank you. Yeah, disincentivizing that for sure. Disincentivizing buy to let, taxing rents on sort of second properties and professional lettings more aggressively.
Yep.
Things you can do there you need to be careful with that because you don't then want to just keep driving the price of rents up
by setting the base lower.
Yeah, but
hopefully also just cut yields and less demand means price goes down.
So
concluding,
we're coming close to the end of the episode, and I suppose now it's a good time to draw it back to the main headline question.
Are landlords evil?
Are landlords evil?
I mean, they definitely capitalize on those who are shut out of the housing market and actually exacerbate the problem, especially those professional landlords. Some of them, I guess, like they're not even renting out, just rich people who own things in the UK or whatever. But it does also seem to be a product of the emphasis on the importance of home ownership and the view of home ownership as an asset, which is kind of not on them. When you've been raised to view home ownership as the best investment, a good way to make money, it's not a surprise that so many people do it.
It's the kind of don't hate the player, hate the game.
Well, yeah, but I mean, this is what we're going to come to and assess, right?
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing. Just because landlords are a product of capitalist incentives doesn't mean that we therefore ought to be uncritical of that behavior. I think it's like you're saying, it's legal, but is it necessarily moral? That's the kind of key point.
It's the same as eating too much red meat or working at Goldman Sachs. Sometimes just because something is legal doesn't mean a decent person should opt to do it.
Yeah, I do think this is trickier because I think all the incentives are there in a sort of capitalist society where ultimately everyone is to some extent looking after themselves, and policies have literally designed to be like, hey, you should do more of this. This is a great opportunity. It's hard to blame people for not taking more of a sort of macro stance of like, hey, wait a second, this isn't necessarily good for society.
And the problem is now we've created a house of cards, and it's like we can't even make housing affordable quickly because then you're going to be screwing over every single person who has a mortgage. Right? The fact that housing prices will probably go down in the next year or two is already a problem for a lot of people.
We never actually defined the term evil at the beginning, but I think you all took this colloquially to mean
morally reprehensible.
Yeah, sure. Like, is it a bad thing? Is it immoral? Is it the kind of behavior
shouldn't do?
Yeah.
This is funny. Jake's girlfriend has just texted me saying, "Happy birthday, rat." I assume it meant to be ant.
Wrong animal.
Yeah. Happy birthday, rat. We'll throw that there. Any further thoughts? Anything you want to say?
I mean, this was a really interesting episode. And like we were saying earlier, viewing housing as an asset class, encouraging it as an asset class, and all these things are things that we ultimately can address. I guess that's kind of the sort of take-home point I'd want to drive, is that we've defined a problem, we've gone into it in detail, we've tried to offer some solutions, there's people actually working on this, and that's the important thing. But I think this isn't like a sort of hopeless case where you're kind of relying on people to be better. Ultimately, I think the way you solve this, it's a problem of policy, and I think that's something that's within, it's
within grasp. It's doable.
And governments, in fairness, like, they're slow, their actions are slow, but they're certainly aware of the issue.
They're making buy-to-let less affordable. Yeah. And also the increase in interest rates that's inevitable in the current inflationary environment is going to actually push more buy-to-let landlords to just put their stuff into the market, which can be a good thing. But yeah, I mean, overall, I guess it's one of those ones specific to the question, are landlords evil? It really does feel like one of those ones where, like, I don't want to guilt anyone too much when they're kind of following the rules of the system. But I encourage you, if you're thinking about making money and this is the thing that you're thinking of doing, like we said, at least think like, how can I be value accretive? So like, development makes more sense than just owning a thing and being hands off. And then also consider like other avenues altogether that I can, because you know what, at least if you're going to hold an asset and expect a return for doing nothing, at least do it with like a harmless good like equity, as opposed to something that people actually need. Like, don't buy bread to sell when people are hungry, right? Like you're better than that. You're better than that.
Cool. I think that's a nice place to end it.
Enjoy the post-roll ad. Great chatting. Don't forget to leave a review. consider becoming a Acast Plus member for as little as $1 a month if you want to support us, because you love us. Also, view our TikTok videos, and also thank you to Benny Duckhouse / Ben Chicken Cottage / Benjamin Penguin Palace for enjoying and recording with us.
Yeah, we never got into the ethics of the duck housing market.
The duck housing market.
No, thank you to the Dream Factory. We'll be back next time with a question most likely on the subject of inheritance tax.
That's the thinking. Cheers,
Stay
guys.
tuned for
Bye.
that.
Looking to get into the Halloween spirit? Acast recommends the most chilling podcasts. Tune in and beware.
Hello, I'm Shelby Scott, the host of Scare You to Sleep. Scare You to Sleep is a podcast where I tell you scary stories full of creepy sound effects and music that is soothing yet unsettling to help immerse you into a world of horror. This is a show for those of us who have realized horror can be a strange but relaxing escape from reality. Speaking of escapes, sometimes I lead you through guided nightmares, like a guided meditation, but instead of flowery meadows, I take you on a journey through your own personal nightmare. So come get lost in the terror with me. You can find the show on Acast or wherever you get your podcasts. Sweet screams.